Module 6, Objective 8, identify the major anatomical subdivisions and functions of the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest part of our brain, controlling all conscious thoughts and intellectual functions. It processes somatic sensory and motor information. The gray matter of the cerebrum includes the cerebral cortex and the basal nuclei, while the white matter is deep to the cortex and it surrounds the basal nuclei. Let me talk a bit about this term cortex. If you were to consider a grapefruit, we know that the grapefruit has an outer rind, and that outer layer of tissue of any organ is called the cortex. So it is just this outer layer of tissue for any organ. And we're going to find that a lot of organs within the body have a cortex. So it's just that outer layer of tissue. So by cerebral cortex, we're talking about the outer layer of the cerebrum. There are a couple structures within the cerebrum worth noting. And the first one are the gyri of the neural cortex. And I'm going to jump to an image. It's a little easier to follow. The neural cortex, remember that outer rind, if you will, that outer layer of tissue, is highly convoluted or wrinkled, and that is the cerebral cortex. And those wrinkles are referred to as gyri. So if you were to look down here at this lower portion of this image, here we have sort of a wrinkle. This is the gyrus of within the cerebral cortex. So it is just a wrinkle. If you were to look at that in cross-section, it would look like a mound. So here is the gyrus. If you look at the cerebrum as a whole, we notice that there are two hemispheres, a left and a right hemisphere. And those hemispheres are separated by the longitudinal fissure. And I'm going to jump ahead a few slides until I can find an image that would portray that, and I don't think I'm going to find one. So I will back all the way up. The longitudinal fissure. This separates the two cerebral hemispheres. If you were to look anteriorly at a brain, what you would find is you would have the left and the right hemispheres. And what separates them is a very deep fissure called the longitudinal fissure. The cerebrum is divided into lobes, and luckily they correspond with the overlying bones. So we have an occipital lobe, we have parietal lobe, we have a temporal lobe, and we have a frontal lobe. So that should be relatively easy. Lastly, if you were to separate the temporal and frontal lobes, as we see in this lower image, what we discover is a little island of cortex tucked deep underneath. And this is referred to as the insula, which just means island. So that is the insula. And if we go back to those four terms, we see that we've covered them. So the gyri of the neural cortex are those wrinkles. Their job is to increase the surface area of the cortex. The insula, or the island of the cortex, lies between the temporal and frontal lobes. The longitudinal fissure separates the left and right cerebral hemispheres. And then, of course, the cerebrum as a whole is composed of lobes that correspond with the overlying bones. There are three functional principles of the cerebrum. One, the cerebral hemispheres receive sensory information from and send motor commands to the opposite side of the body. Okay? If you've ever experienced someone who has suffered a stroke and they've lost both muscle and sensory within the left side of their body, the stroke is actually damaging the right side of the cerebrum. So there's at some point, all these fibers cross so that the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body and the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. The second functional principle, the two hemispheres, even though they look alike, they have very different functions. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. And then lastly, the correspondence between a function and a particular region is not precise. Everybody's a little different. And just to sort of illustrate that point, if you were to look at I'll go up here to this image, it's unsoiled. If you were to look at this region and say, I'm just going to make something up, this particular region is associated with music, and individual A, we'll find that individual B, that region, maybe back here. So there's no precise mapping. You know, we saw the dermatomes within the spinal cord and how they control very specific aspects of the body, where we can almost map that out. That's not true with the cerebrum. There is no precise function versus anatomical structure. There's just no precision there. All right, so those are the three functional principles of the cerebrum. The motor and sensory areas of the cortex, if you were to look at the central sulcus, which separates pretty much the frontal from the parietal lobes, and I'm going to jump back to an image just to demonstrate that. Here is the central sulcus, and it separates the frontal from the parietal lobes. This particular sulcus also separates two important gyri, and you can see them here sort of outlined in red and blue. So these individual gyri outlined in red and blue. And let me see if I can find a color to sort of separate that out. So here is the red. We'll use orange. Hopefully that shows up. Here is the blue gyrus. These two are of particular importance. And let me go back to that slide. The precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe is the primary motor cortex. Okay? And what that means is that any time you consciously contract a muscle, so if you were to flex the biceps brachii and cause flexion at the elbow, that is going to be initiated within the primary motor cortex, within that gyrus. So that gyrus takes care of all skeletal muscle conscious contractions. Okay? The cells of that area are known as pyramidal cells, and these are just neurons of that primary motor cortex. The postcentral gyrus, the gyrus just behind that central sulcus, is the primary sensory cortex down here. And the primary sensory cortex is the region of the cortex that allows for conscious awareness of sensations. So if you are aware that you're being touched, that pressure is being applied, if you feel pain or vibration, taste, or temperature, that's because that signal has made it to the primary sensory cortex, to that gyrus, which is just posterior to that central sulcus. So if you are consciously aware of it, the signal made it all the way to that cortex. At what point might not you be aware of a vibration? Well, that really depends on the thalamus. If the thalamus fails to project it onto the cortex, then you're never aware of it. So for instance, we've all found ticks on our body, and we know that those ticks had to crawl there. Why didn't you feel the tick crawling? Well, as the little tick was crawling up the body, that signal was sent up to the thalamus, and the thalamus delayed sending that signal into the cerebral cortex. And because it was not sent to the cortex, you were never aware of it. So that's the significance of this primary sensory cortex. If a signal makes it there, you become consciously aware of it. There are other areas of the cortex that are associated with senses. So we have a visual cortex that receives information from the eyes, the auditory cortex, which receives information from our sound receptors within our ear, the olfactory cortex from our odor receptors, and gustatory cortex from our taste receptors. And just to sort of outline where those are, here is the occipital, within the occipital lobe we have the visual cortex. We have our auditory cortex right here within the temporal lobe. We have the gustatory cortex, partially within this insula, and the olfactory cortex is here within the insula as well. So what we're doing is sort of mapping out this cortex and figuring out the functions that this cortex is responsible for. So we've already mapped out the postcentral gyrus and the precentral gyrus. We know what those are for. And now we've mapped out some other areas or real estate within this cerebral cortex, looking at, the visual cortex back here, and of course the auditory and olfactory cortexes and the gustatory cortex. So we're slowly sort of filling in this map to understand how the cortex works, or what functions the cortex undertake. Somatic sensory association areas interpret input into or to the primary sensory cortex that recognize and responds to touch. The visual association area interprets activities within the visual cortex. Auditory association area monitors auditory cortex. So even though, and I'm just going to give one example, the auditory cortex that we saw back here. So here's your auditory cortex. It's going to receive information from the ear, and it's going to be interpreted as sounds. So for instance, if I were to start speaking Swahili, you would hear it, and that's because the auditory cortex is going to interpret the information coming from our inner ear. So you will hear the sounds. What the auditory association area does is it interprets those sounds. And since you likely don't know Swahili, you're not going to be able to interpret that. But let's look at a language that you are familiar with, such as English. Prior to learning English, you were able to hear sounds, and that was primarily due to signals coming from the ear to the auditory cortex. Once you have mastered the English language, the auditory association area is going to interpret. So it interprets those sounds, and it provides meaning. So you now understand what I'm saying. Same thing with the visual association area. It's going to interpret activity within the visual cortex, so it's going to make sense of what you're seeing. So these other real estate regions of the cortex are used to interpret. Hemispheric lateralization. There are functional differences between the left and right hemispheres. Each cerebral hemisphere performs certain functions that are not ordinarily performed by the opposite hemisphere. The left hemisphere, which is dominant in most people, controls reading, writing, math, decision-making, speech, and language, while the right hemisphere is more touchy-feely. They're going to relate to senses and recognitions. Probably a very crude way to break this down. I always consider folks who are more right hemisphere dominant to be more artsy. They're more in touch with emotions and senses, while the left hemisphere are more analytical.